Welcome to the Integrative Medicine Podcast. I'm Dr. Jordan Robertson. In this podcast, the best of both worlds of medicine come together, informing you of your healthcare options. This podcast is for the ultra-discerning, highly critical, and results-oriented health consumer, filtering out the good, the bad, and the real ugly when it comes to health information. As your host, my mission is to help you navigate the world of evidence-based integrative care and confidently make choices to help you live your best life. Enjoy! Okay, welcome to another episode of the Integrative Medicine Podcast. Today, I'm joined by a naturopathic doctor, Dr. Leah Saunders, who is the owner of True Roots Healthcare in Uxbridge, Ontario. Leah has just recently written a paper for the Canadian Association of Naturopathic Doctors, all focused on sleep. And I was fortunate enough to get a sneak peek of that paper before it went to publication and knew that I really wanted Leah to hop on the podcast and talk to us about the evidence about sleep, because this is one of the most challenging things that we try and work with patients. So thank you so much for being on the show, Leah.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited and honored to be here with you.
So you focus so much on sleep. Can you just give us a little bit of background about your interest and passion on this particular topic? Because I think you do such a great job educating patients online about the importance of sleep and how to show up as a rested person in their life. How did you get there? Like, how did this become something you were so interested in?
Absolutely. So to sum it all up, really, if we're not sleeping, we're not healing. And how I came to be so passionate and interested in sharing that with my patients and the world really was my own experience with sleep deprivation. So for any other parents out there, you've gone through periods when your baby is young or your kids are disrupting your sleep. And for me, this was something that I was worried about going through pregnancy and facing new parenthood. And then once I was in the midst of it, it had a profound impact on my energy, of course, but also my mood and my mental health. And now that I'm out of that stage, I can look back and really recognize that I wasn't okay. And I was really struggling with managing all aspects of my life. And when it came down to it, if I could have just had a bit more sleep, then I probably would have felt a whole lot better during that time. And then it helped me appreciate how many of my patients are really struggling with sleep and probably why they're also struggling with their health. And when we get patients to sleep better, not necessarily longer, but when we really have a well-rested individual, their immune system, their mood, their nervous system, their digestive system, their cardiovascular system are just set up for health. So that's how I got here.
Awesome. So you brought up a few kind of cool things when you were talking there. You're saying, that the quality of the sleep is important, maybe not necessarily the length. So I think it's a great question to even just start with, like, how would a patient know if their sleep is a problem, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. So number one is, how's your energy, right? That's one thing we probably both ask our patients quite often. And if somebody's coming in with a chief complaint of fatigue, we often obviously look at sleep. So when it comes to looking at if your sleep is problematic, one of the things we want to take into account is energy. So if you have good energy in the day, you're probably not struggling with sleep. You're probably getting enough. If you are feeling tired, which you could probably agree, Jordan, that our patients come in and often at the forefront of their complaints are fatigue, we want to take a look at sleep. So how long is it taking you to fall asleep? And if it's taking you long enough that you're realizing you're lying there and you're getting frustrated, that is a problem, because really we should hit the pillow and within 10, maybe 15 minutes have fallen asleep without realizing that we've been lying there for longer than that. And then the duration ideally is between 7 to 9 hours, but also the quality within that matters. So if you're in bed for 9 hours, but waking up frequently and having a restless sleep that's not really restorative, it doesn't count as 9 hours of sleep. What's more important is how much time you're actually asleep for versus time spent in bed.
Right. Okay. So if patients are getting somewhere in that 7 to 9 hours, but they're still fatigued in the morning, maybe we need to look a little bit deeper at the quality of that sleep. Is that kind of what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, absolutely. The quality of their sleep. And then, of course, looking at why that 7 to 9 hours of sleep might not be restorative. So are there other systems playing a role?
And so why is this important? Because I think in clinical practice, my experience is that patients will deprioritize sleep. I even know in my own personal health, I have gone through windows of time where I've deprioritized my sleep because you can get by during the day. It doesn't seem to be that problematic. But one of the things I found so interesting about your paper was looking at some of the long-term consequences when adults are not getting that 7 to 9 hours
Hmm.
from a bigger health perspective, like why is this important that we even focus on it?
Right. And one point to consider is that humans are the only species that purposely delay or deprioritize our sleep. The only other time that happens in nature is when animals are facing a famine and searching for food. So we think that if we sleep less, we can accomplish more, but there has to be a price that we'll pay in some way or another. And with regards to our health, if you're sleeping then average less than an average of 7 hours a night. So the study in my paper that I was looking at took into account short sleepers, which was less than 6 hours. It actually showed a relative risk of increased mortality of about 1.12, which means a 12% absolute increase in mortality. We're also looking at significant increased risk of things like type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, and obesity. And that's specific to the cardiometabolic system, not necessarily looking at other aspects of its implication on our energy and our mood and our immune system.
And do we know why that is? Like, why does sleep have such a profound impact on that cardiometabolic system?
When we sleep well, we get a chance to restore and repair. And deep sleep specifically is when we can really wash out and spend time in that parasympathetic state, which is the time when we're in that restoration and repair mode. And so when we are spending less time asleep, we wake up in more of a sympathetic dominant state, which is the state when our nervous system takes on as if we were running from that lion, tiger, or bear, which means we're going to have higher levels of hormones like cortisol and adrenaline and norepinephrine. So those hormones that make us feel like we're in a rush, we're go, 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 we're stressed, we're anxious. And those are the hormones that will elevate our heart rate and that will elevate our blood pressure and that will elevate that sense of anxiety for us. And so when we haven't spent enough time asleep, our nervous system doesn't actually get a chance to take those hormones down to the level that they can be to allow healing and repair to occur.
I think in my some of the reading that I've done, we also see like a change in health habits and behavior the following day after sleep restriction
Yeah.
too, which is so interesting. Like even one night of sleep restriction and like otherwise healthy patients will change their nutritional tendencies the following day. So they eat way more
Absolutely.
carbohydrates, they eat way more calories in general. They have a harder time satisfying their appetite. And then certainly in the menopause research, we see that women just move around a lot less. They
Mm-hmm.
may like hightail it to the gym and like drag themselves there, but their actual like daily energy expenditure goes down as a consequence of their fatigue. Is that what you see too, like even in your clinical practice?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's where it comes back to really using energy and daily energy as kind of an independent biomarker, I guess, to say how well are you sleeping or how much are you sleeping enough. If you have the energy to get through the day and feel emotionally regulated and feel motivated to achieve your goals, that's great. And if sleep quality isn't there to support those things, then maybe we need to address it.
I think when I'm working with patients on sleep, like one of the challenges is that people feel like it's something that's not in their control, right? So they
Mhm.
have insomnia, right? Like almost like
Mhm.
they've caught it like a contagious disease. And I think that that will skew the way we perceive treatment for sleep. And certainly historically, a lot of our treatment for sleep has been just about like sedating the patient and having the patient be put into like a medically induced sleep, I think we're seeing a shift in the way that we're approaching sleep. Can you just reflect on that a little bit? Like, why do patients feel like it's like not in their control? And is it, right? Like, is it actually in their control to change their sleep?
Yes. So I think part of it comes from it's such an ingrained biological process that's shared across all species, right? Like every species sleeps. So we think it should be something that comes naturally and something that just happens. But ultimately, what you do during the day affects how well you will sleep at night. And the reality is that you have so much more control over your sleep than you might think. And it comes from, let's say, looking at caffeine intake to start. So the average person takes about 12 hours to fully metabolize a cup or a serving of caffeine. So if we're consuming caffeine throughout the day, even if you're one of those people that's saying, no, I can have an espresso before bed and then fall asleep, it might just be that you're not getting into as deep of sleep stages as you possibly could if you weren't consuming caffeine at all. And we could challenge people to say, let's reduce it and see how well, especially if you're looking at a polysomnography or a sleep study, caffeine does change the stages of sleep that an individual will experience, even if they are asleep. Um, so much of our day is spent exposed to blue light. So you and I right now are sitting in front of screens, and we probably will for the rest of the day and into the evening. So whether that's at work or at home when you're on your phone in the evening, that blue light ultimately is just telling our bodies that it's artificially still daytime. And it's telling our brain to not yet produce melatonin, that key hormone that helps us initiate sleep, because it thinks it's still midday when the sun is shining. And if we look at how much exposure has, or increased exposure to blue light we've experienced over the past 10, 20, 50 years, it's an incredible amount. And so partly it's looking at technology exposure and maybe reducing that and screen time before bed to help us understand that it's time to unwind. And that comes with that mental aspect too. Our lives are busier than ever before. And when we are go, go, go and don't necessarily have an opportunity to slow down and reflect on some of those things that might be causing us stress, it will happen at night when our head hits the pillow and there are no other distractions. So partly it's also managing that nervous system and our mood and our ability to manage and respond to stress as well.
So, and what are some practical tips? So, you gave the idea of like just less screen time. Are there any other behaviors or strategies that you suggest that people start to look at, either things that they need to stop doing or maybe things they need to start doing to try and help manipulate their sleep?
Yeah, so if we said stop doing to start, I always recommend that patients limit caffeine to 12 hours before bed if they have it at all, if they're struggling with sleep. Alcohol is another one to consider because it will reduce our ability to get that deep REM sleep, which is the sleep stage when you dream. And it will also increase your body temperature. And we need our core body temperature to drop at night in order to get into that deep sleep and stay there. So if you're having a coffee at 2 p.m. to get yourself through the rest of that workday, and then you're having a glass of wine at 9 p.m. to unwind, it's a pretty brutal combination when you're trying to optimize your sleep. Eating too close to bed could impact because as well, eating and then ultimately digesting your food is a thermogenic process, which means it's going to increase that core body temperature. So if you've got that big, nice steak and potato dinner with a glass of red wine too close to bed, you've probably had trouble sleeping, or that turkey dinner at Thanksgiving or Christmas that night. And we joke about the meat sweats, but it's because your core body temperature is affected by that. So reducing your intake of large amounts of food to 3 to 4 hours before bed can be extremely helpful. And then really kind of bridging between like not doing and doing is maybe we can't change the stress that's in your life, but we can help you better respond to and manage that. So is it reflecting on your day through a journaling or gratitude practice? Is it doing yoga or meditation? And meditation particularly has some great research behind it in regards to managing the nervous system and optimizing sleep. Or maybe is it finding another coping strategy or skill for you, like exercise? Again, that we don't want too close to bed because that can positively increase our stress hormones and core body temperature. So maybe finding that optimal routine where you're sleeping or you're exercising earlier in the day to sleep better at night. And we really want to make sure that you're getting into a good bedtime routine that allows you to unwind. So take care of anything that's on your mind from earlier in the day. What do you maybe need to get ready for the next day so you're not replaying those to-do lists over the course of the night? Reducing that blue light screen exposure in the evening. And then also making sure your room is actually really dark, because even small lights from your alarm clock or any other technology devices could be just impacting that melatonin level and disrupting you or waking you if you're just rousing. And so really making sure your sleep environment is conducive. Part of that too, which is easy to do at this time of year, is making sure your room is cool enough. So the recommendation is like 18 degrees over the winter. That's pretty easy. And that allows your body temperature to kind of lower and stay low over the course of the night, because you've probably experienced difficulty falling asleep in a really hot environment, but that doesn't typically happen in a cool environment unless it's really cold.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Those are great tips. Usually what I suggest with patients, I say, like, when you lie down and turn off the lights, that cannot be the first time that you think about how you are. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
That, taking in so much information and go, that they need to carve out some kind of something
Yes.
before they hit the pillow, and that can look like whatever they need, but you cannot reflect on your day for the first time when your head hits the pillow, because
Absolutely.
how much that changes sort of the likelihood that you're going to be able to fall asleep. Now, these sound like such simple behaviors. What's the research behind these behaviors, right? Like, what do we find in the evidence or in the research that how impactful these things are on sleep?
It's a good question. I don't know that we have, and this might be a gap in the research in terms of large studies, because we know things like alcohol and caffeine affect our sleep. So we don't really need to do a study to determine how much, I
Right.
guess.
Yeah.
Foods and diet, like, it's just so challenging to study nutrition in general. I don't know that we could design a study that could incorporate just that and its impact on sleep. But to what I'm aware, there's nothing specific looking at diet to say like one type in particular. What we can say there is just looking at basic physiology. If your blood sugar is imbalanced over the course of the night, that could also be contributing to why you're waking up. And blue light, it's more of a kind of looking at things retrospectively and saying we know how much sleep has changed over the past 100 years. I think 100 years ago, most people were sleeping 8 to 9 hours. And I think now it's like less than 30% of the American population is sleeping more than 6. That's a short time for these habits for sleep when we spend 30% of our life or more asleep to keep up with health challenges. So I think there's a lot of room for us to do more research and look at that evidence.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like right now, like most of these practices and things that we're encouraging people to do is based off some of the biological theories around what our optimal sleep situation looks like, and then looking at the lifestyle behaviors that would be contrary to that, right? So
yes,
we want like a lower body temperature, and therefore things that interfere with that are maybe things that we should avoid. We know that we need adequate melatonin production, and then that tends to happen with darkness and therefore our screen time. But there hasn't been a study to say if we took patients with insomnia and gave them blue light blocking glasses, they slept better.
There's one study that looked at blue light blocking glasses. It was very small, but it did have a positive outcome. The other challenge with researching sleep in general that maybe we could just touch on is that we're often relying on individuals to report their sleep at home, right? So if you're involved in a study that's looking at an intervention for sleep and whether it helps or doesn't help your sleep, you're not sleeping in a lab every single night for 8 to 10 weeks and having your sleep cycles tracked on a polysomnography. You're sleeping at home and then reporting how well or not you've been sleeping. And humans are notoriously pretty bad at actually recording or accurately recording how well they've slept or not. And that goes both ways. So when you give somebody a sleeping medication, they'll often report a significant improvement in their quote unquote sleep, which is actually when they're just being sedated, but there's not necessarily as a significant improvement from the sleep study perspective, which is really interesting. So that is a huge area of improvement that we could make and look at in terms of sleep research and how we could improve studies and patients' abilities to actually track their sleep and the impact of interventions on it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we've seen more and more, like a lot of the wearable devices now are trying to make some sort of approximation on sleep. I haven't spent enough time on it myself. I do know that, as far as like tracking your total number of hours slept, they're maybe not doing a terrible job. I'm not sure how good some of these devices are at differentiating between the stages of sleep. But that's something I think that, maybe is giving some patients a little bit more mindfulness about their amount of sleep, is that their Fitbit or whatever it is that they're wearing is reporting their hours in the morning.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And the most important thing for those devices is like use one consistently and stick to that, because if it is inconsistent, it's at least going to be inconsistent to you,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so that's what I was going to say as well. It's just sometimes helpful because you, again, think like, oh yeah, I had so many hours last night, but if the device is telling you less than that, it's surprising to say, okay, we know optimal health outcomes will be when you're sleeping between 7 to 9 hours, ideally 8. And then if you can look back on an average that these apps will give you, and if it says that you're on average sleeping 6.5 or 7 hours, then that can bring to your attention that you need to sleep a bit more.
So you made that comment about research studies being 8 to 12 weeks long. I do find in clinical practice that if we don't hit the nail on the head with sleep, and that if patients don't sleep well in the first 2 or 3 days after
Mm-hmm.
trying a treatment
Mm-hmm.
plan, they want to throw in the towel. Or that when you start to make suggestions about changing their sleep plan, they'll say, oh, well, I've tried that and it didn't work. And when you inquire a little bit further, and I actually have added questions in my case taking to say, oh, you've tried, say, melatonin. You've tried melatonin. How long did you try it for? And did you
Mm-hmm.
take it consistently? And quite often patients have not tried something consistently. I'm going to borrow from one of our colleagues. They sampled the treatment plan rather than like legitimately tried it. How long should patients commit to these sort of sleep plans in order to see benefit, right? Like, what are our expectations there over time?
Yeah, I was thinking about this as well because we have studies that will typically look anywhere in the 8 to 12 week time, like we've said, and patients will report improvements by the end of that, but obviously they're going to be experiencing benefit before. And so I think the response is going to be highly individualized according to the original issue that's causing the sleep. So at the beginning, we were saying, is your sleep insomnia, or is your insomnia related to your anxiety? Is your insomnia or restless sleep related to restless legs or a pain condition? Is it related to jet lag? So jet lag is going to be something that we can probably correct within 3 to 7 days with a course of melatonin. Right? So that is going to be something that corrects very quickly versus something like sleep apnea, which is going to take time for you to lose weight and address other lifestyle aspects and use an intervention like a CPAP machine before we see benefit. So I'm not really sure how to give specific guidelines in terms of saying like you should feel like you're sleeping better in X amount of time, other than to say what you said in that the plan has to be put in place consistently for a period of time and all elements of it, right? So if somebody is really struggling with anxiety and still using their screen all night, like that's part of a program to address insomnia. And if that element isn't in place, then how can we say that them taking melatonin isn't effective.
Right.
Right? Does that make sense? Because it's like there's things counteracting, or if they're still a high consumer of caffeine and then trying to take, instead of the wine, they replace that with like a herbal supplement to address sleep. So I think it's a multi-tiered approach, and we have to get really serious about our sleep. And it's not super exciting. It's not revolutionary, but if we can almost come back to some of the most basic things that affect our health and really recognize committing to an optimal sleep plan helps you perform better during the day, because you can emotionally regulate better, you can focus and concentrate, you ultimately are more productive when you're well rested, versus trying to buy that time by sacrificing your sleep.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. We think sort of more philosophically about treating sleep. It's almost like patients want, or we want, that like magic diet pill
Mm-hmm.
kind of approach to treating sleep, where the science has actually evolved away from sedation. It's interesting to reflect back on another podcast that I did with Adam Livingston about
Mm-hmm.
cannabis. 20 years ago, there was research on using Ativan to help people get off their cannabis. And now there's evidence for using cannabis to help people get off their Ativan.
Right.
We actually have shifted the way we're thinking about sedating patients, because we know that it's not effective in the long term, and it's maybe creating more harm than good as far as addiction and low sleep quality, etc. But that's a real mindset shift away from this treatment plan will sedate me and therefore I will just get to
Yes.
sleep under any circumstance,
Yep.
versus putting all the control back in the patient's hands and saying your patterns of behavior, just like your pattern of diet, is going to slowly influence your sleep. And that's a totally different perspective than what we've historically taken around, treating insomnia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would 100% agree.
So what are the most effective treatment
Yeah,
options? If
when it
someone's now
comes to
listening to
that.
this, I mean, we've touched on a couple of potential considerations, but when you went through the research, like what did you find to be the most effective option that patients should be considering as a first line consideration?
So, hands down is something called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or CBTI. So, CBTI is a specific program that takes into account the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is essentially, and I'm going to entirely paraphrase this, but how our thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and actions are all intertwined, but specifically to insomnia. So again, coming back to helping you understand what you do during the day and leading up until sleep affects how well you are sleeping at night. And then there's some very specific behavioral interventions for CBTI that patients can implement right away. And so the number one thing, for example, is picking a consistent wake up time. So maybe we're really, you're like your patient who has felt like they've tried everything, or on the flip side, maybe they're not interested, because sometimes patients are hesitant to take some form of sedative medications or supplements. The most important thing you can do is stick to a regular sleep-wake schedule. So by getting up at a consistent time, and then without over caffeinating or napping during the day after a bad night's sleep, you build sleep pressure over the course of the day. So can we jump into that for a second, what that sleep pressure is? Because I think it would be
Yeah.
helpful for listeners and even practitioners to understand. So when we wake up in the morning, let's say we're well rested, our nervous system is, let's say, like ready to go in the best way. And over the course of the day, it will generate something called adenosine, which is a chemical that will increasingly cause us to feel tired the longer we're awake. So humans will reach that kind of maximal state of awakeness and begin to feel tired around 14 to 16 hours after waking. So if you're up at 6 a.m., that translates to about 8 to 10 p.m. So when we drink caffeine or consume caffeine, it will block adenosine from communicating with our cells, and that's how we feel more awake on caffeine. So adenosine isn't really interacting with our cells to tell us that we're tired. And then what happens when we sleep is that adenosine has an opportunity to leave our nervous system so that we can wake up feeling refreshed and energized again. If you have had a poor night's sleep, let's say, and then you have an extra cup of coffee, or maybe you have an afternoon nap, those are ways that we're essentially preventing adenosine from communicating to our brain properly, or actually washing it out enough to give us a second wind. So then those two things will push our bedtime the next day a little bit later. And then it's harder to get up at your regular time the next day. So essentially, when you pick a consistent wake up time and you say like, okay, I'm getting up at 6 a.m. every day, regardless of how I've slept, without over caffeinating and napping the next day, then you're more likely to go to bed earlier the next night, because that sleep pressure has built over the day, and then you're going to fall asleep quicker and more likely to stay in a deeper sleep the following night.
That's tough for people to execute, but
Yes.
that's amazing advice. I know in my own personal, I don't not sleep well very often, but I will occasionally get that 3 o'clock wake up.
Mm-hmm.
And on those days, I am even more mindful to restrict my caffeine after
Mm-hmm.
about 9 a.m., which
Mm-hmm.
really creates a horrific afternoon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because just based on getting up at 3 a.m., you want to go to bed like at 6 p.m.,
Yep.
but you like to even have a shot at making up that sleep the following night. You need to be exhausted rather
Mm-hmm.
than this like terrible wired,
Mm-hmm.
caffeine situation going into those evenings, even though it's very difficult. So I think that's great advice, that sometimes even when we've had a poor sleep, over medicating yourself during the day is actually not going to give you that restoration the following night.
Yeah, exactly. And if you are waking up at that 3 a.m., another part of CBTI is to say, okay, remove yourself from your bed, go to another room or space in your home, do something that's very low stimulatory. So, like, don't open your phone and scroll through social media, turn on a very low level light, and maybe read a book. Allow that sleep pressure to start to build again. And then when you feel tired enough to go back to sleep, go back to your bed. So then we start really associating our bed with the only place that we sleep, instead of it being the place that we're lying there awake and frustrated and then generating that cortisol hormone to make us feel more stressed. And then our mind starts racing and we're worrying about all the things that we have to do the following day. As well as in the evening, when you should just be tired enough to go to bed when you're actually getting in bed, instead of lying there waiting to fall asleep. So a great analogy by Matthew Walker, who's written a wonderful book called Why We Sleep, is that we would never sit at the dining room table waiting to get hungry. Right? So why do we
Right.
get into bed and wait to fall asleep? We should feel hungry and then eat, and we should feel tired and then go to sleep.
And I always think that lack of confidence that patients have that their sleep is going to happen for them is part
Mm-hmm.
of their obstacle, right? Because they do get worked up and anxious. And um, yeah, that's such a good point.
Yeah, and if we focus less on the bedtime and more on the awake time, that can sometimes put the control back with the patients too, because they're waiting to feel tired enough to go to bed versus stressing that is a certain time on the clock.
Hmm. So when should patients consider having a sleep study? Like what I think, we always assume a sleep study is mostly about apnea, and there's a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of a myth about apnea being about snoring.
Mm-hmm.
When should patients consider having a sleep study done?
Well, definitely if they suspect that they have sleep apnea, I think that is really important, right? So snoring could be one symptom, but also if your partner is listening to you sleep and finding that you're waking or stopping breathing. The other thing you can do if you don't have a partner is Google Stop Bang questionnaire. And that's an 8-point, really simple questionnaire that medical providers and patients can quickly answer that will give you a score back on your likelihood of apnea. So if if it comes back with a significant result, then you would definitely want to consult your general practitioner and ask for a sleep study. I would also say you would be interested in having a sleep study if you suspect that you have another condition that a sleep study can recognize. So something like restless leg syndrome, for example. If you or your partner can complain of your legs moving throughout the night, or you feel like you just can't relax or settle, or if your sleep is very restless, then that could also be helpful. I would also say if you're peri or postmenopausal and still dealing with a lot of those menopausal symptoms like hot flashes, there's so much research to support addressing hot flashes through a variety of different ways that ultimately help impact sleep. And the number of women that complain, of insomnia during the perimenopausal and menopausal period is really high. And I think it's somewhat underestimated too. Because a lot of women, when you ask in clinical practice, how do you sleep? They'll just say, oh, I don't sleep well. I never have. So I think a lot of women don't even bring up the concern to their practitioners or think it's just something that they have to deal with. So if there's something medical that we can address to improve your sleep, that's when we need to have you go in. So if you're someone who feels the need to pull over and nap, or you feel like your eyes are always heavy while driving, we really need to figure out why you're feeling so sleepy at that time. And I think that's a huge concern, because drowsy driving accidents kill on average more than substance involved, like drinking or drug induced accidents, which is an alarming amount. And so that, for me, I think is a red flag for patients to really understand the quality and quantity of their sleep.
So it sounds like some of the big take homes for patients, I think, just even to do like a mindful assessment of their sleep situation, right? So like we said, kind of all the way throughout, if there is some other medical condition that's getting in the way of your sleep, whether it be prostatitis and frequent urination, or anxiety, or hot flashes, or sleep apnea, like that's going to be a continuous obstacle to achieving the quality of sleep that you deserve to have. And so taking sort of a thought and assessment about that situation, so at least you can have a productive conversation with your practitioner about it. I usually, when I suggest, or if patients have been suggested to have a sleep study, I don't want them to procrastinate on that. So quite often when patients approach my office and I suggest they have a sleep study, they have a requisition for a sleep study, but haven't gone, right? Because they want to look for another answer other than a CPAP, when really the sleep study is it's a lab assessment, right? It's an assessment tool. And so if you have a requisition for a sleep study, I can't encourage you enough to actually go. But then the other big take home is just how in control patients are with some of the things that are related to their sleep, right? Are there any resources that patients can look at, or like how do you suggest someone gets started looking at something like the CBTI or other programs that might give them some tools so that they know how to coach themselves through their sleep challenge?
So I think working with a practitioner can be super helpful just to identify those parts, right? So what aspect, is it an underlying medical condition, or is it maybe something like anxiety, let's say? And if it's anxiety, do we need to have you work with somebody to focus on that? Or can we do some elements of the CBTI, whether, again, that's a practitioner who is walking you through that. There's also group-based and online-based programs, and we can link that in the show notes. There's a couple of resources that we can direct people online where they can jump on easily access online programs to get started with that CBT program.
Awesome. And if you were going to give our listeners a bit of a take home, the floor is yours on why this is such an important thing for them to consider. But what's your big message that you want to get out there about sleep?
Just that it's the ultimate foundation of health. And so I said this at the beginning, but when we're not sleeping, we're not healing. And you talked about too, like if you're not sleeping and then your nutritional choices are compromised the following day, that's also going to compromise your ability to lose weight. So regardless of the concern that you're maybe going forward with regards to your health, we can probably almost always bring it back to sleep. So, and it's a vicious cycle in many cases. You have an anxiety and you don't sleep, and then you don't sleep, and that's going to prolong or maybe exacerbate your anxiety the following day. So we need to identify where we can interrupt that vicious cycle and put the control back in the patient's hands. That's the message I'd love to share, is that you have so much more control over your sleep than you might recognize. And if we can get you sleeping better, we can positively impact every aspect of your health.
Amazing. So if patients want to learn more about sleep and about you, where can they get and find some of that information?
I'm really active on Instagram, and my handle is Dr. Leah Saunders, ND, and my first name is spelled Leigha. And I have some resources on there where people can jump on and get my sleep checklist for the top 7 tips. And I run a lot of events locally and sometimes virtually to help people recognize how much control and what they can do to sleep better.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your passion and expertise with us today. And we'll put all the links that people need to access those resources in the show notes. Thanks so much, Leah.
Thanks, Jordan.
This concludes our episode of the Integrative Medicine Podcast. As I strive to bring you the tools and advice you need to make well-educated healthcare choices, I hope you listen along. Questions about the podcast or topic requests can be forwarded to our email at imedresearchhub@gmail.com. Remember to subscribe to receive updates on the latest episodes through iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play.